Penny Wong, welcome to the program. So, as the Treasurer points out, this will mean less debt. It also means fewer people are needing JobKeeper than we thought were on it. Is that good news?
Well, let's remember this is the government that doubled the debt before the bushfires and the coronavirus hit Australia. But let's understand this. This is a $60 billion black hole in the economic credibility of the Morrison government. $60 billion of reasons why we can't trust anything Scott Morrison or Josh Frydenberg say about the economy or the budget. And perhaps worse, David, has been the failure to front up and take responsibility. Scott Morrison, just like in the bushfires, has been in hiding. Josh Frydenberg hasn't fronted up and taken responsibility. He should do that, and we will give him the opportunity. The Senate committee, the chair of the Senate committee into the COVID-19 response of the government, Senator Gallagher, will call Josh Frydenberg to give evidence at that committee. And what I'd say to Josh, this is your opportunity to front up and explain this $60 billion blunder to the Parliament and the Australian people.
All right, so you're going to call the Treasurer to appear before this Senate committee. Do you have the power to compel him to appear?
Ultimately, it's whether he has the courage and the responsibility. It's ultimately up to him. I would make this point, though. Scott Morrison did. Scott Morrison previously, when he was a minister, did appear before a Senate committee. We'd say to Josh, when you've got a budget blunder of this size, I reckon it's about time you fronted up and explained it.
Can you just clear up for me? We know Labor's raised concern about the people who missed out on JobKeeper, the casuals, the temporary visa holders and so on. Are you now saying they should get JobKeeper?
Well, ultimately, these are decisions the government has to make. We have previously called for casuals to be included, and our position hasn't changed. We have previously called for workers such as those at Donata to be included, and our position hasn't changed. And I think this is the key point. 600,000 Australians lost their job in April. How many fewer would have lost their jobs if Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg hadn't made this blunder?
So you do think these payments should be extended to, roughly 1 million more casuals, others who work for government-owned entities?
As I've said, we've previously called for those casual workers to be included. Our position hasn't changed. Ultimately, it's up to the government to bring forward what it wants to do with the $60 billion. It should come forward with the costings. It should come forward with the explanation. It should come forward with the explanation that Annabelle, I think, referenced, which is why is it that we have some workers excluded and some workers included, when really, when you've got a situation where somebody who's been a casual, worked for 11 months is excluded, someone who's a part-time worker is getting many times more their ordinary time earnings. And these are anomalies which we've been pointing out.
Let's turn to the relationship with China. I want to play the comments of your colleague Joel Fitzgibbon to Patricia Karvelis the other day.
We were always going to have an inquiry, PK. So we didn't need to be out there in front offending the Chinese. And if we hadn't done that, we might not be having some of the diplomatic relationship troubles we're having at the moment. We might not be dealing with barley. Barley may have fixed itself, the barley export ban, and we might not have 4 meat processors prevented from exporting to China, and we might not have started our conversation today about what might or might not happen with iron ore.
Do you agree with Joel Fitzgibbon?
Well, look, I've spoken to Joel about those comments, and what I'd say is this. I mean, Joel is a passionate advocate for regional Australia. He's a passionate advocate for Australian farmers, and what he was expressing in that interview was what is being said to him. As Simon Birmingham, I think, said this week, you can understand why people are making those connections. What I think is the inquiry is in Australia's national interest. I would make the point it's an inquiry that ultimately China and the US supported. I've also made the point, which I think even Greg Sheridan said was reasonable. That it was a little odd that Senator Payne chose to announce it on your program without having locked in some support. It's for the government to explain why they thought that was the right thing to do. But our focus now really should be on how do we try and resolve the trade dispute which is affecting Australian barley growers particularly, and also our beef exporters.
But this really, the point you make there, it was a little odd, you say, for Australia to announce a call for this inquiry before building an international coalition. This really gets to the nub of the difficulty in our relationship. Are you saying that Australia should have held back until there were more voices calling for an inquiry?
I think it is a matter for the government to explain why it thought it was better to announce it.
What's your view? What's your view here, Senator?
Well, if I were the Foreign Minister of Australia, I'd certainly front up and explain to you why. And if I were the Foreign Minister, I probably would have tried to get some support before I announced it. I think that would have been sensible. But look, let's go to the issue of the dispute. There are many people out there who are making many comments about why we have this dispute with China. Whatever the reasons, we do need to try and resolve it. I would also make this point, David. One of the things which has not been discussed much in the context of this trade dispute is the effect of the US-China trade.
And I want to come to that. But can I just pick up? I want to come to that. Sorry, but if we can just pick up on the point you've said there, you do think Australia should have got more support for the inquiry before announcing it. Why?
Oh well, I think that would be the usual diplomatic practice.
Because why? Because it might offend China? I'm just trying to tease this out.
I might finish. Well, I'd like to, if I can finish my answer. It would be the usual diplomatic practice to do that. The government may have reasons for that, and I think that's for the government to explain. But we have been very clear about the inquiry. We've said, as Anthony Albanese and I have said many times, it's an unremarkable proposition. We've had many people around the world die. We've got the worst pandemic in a century. Of course, the international community should work together on both the origins and how we better respond.
There are a lot of points of tension, though, in the relationship, whether it's China's treatment of the Uyghur people, whether it's actions in Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea and so on. Are you saying we should only speak up when we have others by our side? Or like, how do we balance this?
Well, that's never been something I've said. What I've said about the relationship with China is this. I think we have to approach that relationship with consistency and discipline and with a long-term lens. So a 30-year perspective, not a 3-year, and certainly not a 24-hour media cycle. I've said we should always be prosecuting, promoting, protecting our national interests and our values, and of course our sovereignty. But I do think we should remember that we do that, protect and promote our interests and values by what we do, not by what we say. And there has been a tendency in recent days, you I think, had a clip of George Christensen in last week's Insiders program. There's been a tendency for some in the coalition to think that talking tough is the same as being tough. Now, the escalation of anti-China rhetoric and potentially anti-Chinese sentiment, I don't think isn't good for the Australian community, and I don't think it, does well for our standing in the world.
Okay, but I just want to be clear about this. You're saying when it comes to the call for an inquiry, we should have held back and waited for an international...
Oh, no, hang on. No. I've said it would be usual diplomatic practice for something like that, for you to ensure you had some support before announcing it. The government may have reasons for that. It's up to the government to explain it. I think it's a matter of historical record that the announcement was made before we made diplomatic overtures to other countries. That's what the Prime Minister said. And
you've said this morning you don't think that's the way it should have happened. We should have built that international coalition. But I want to make sure this is clear.
It's not just this morning. I've said that, David. I've said that on a number of occasions.
But you're not saying we should pull our punches in any way. When we believe in something, we shouldn't worry about offending China. So how do we strike that balance?
Well, look. The point I'd make is I said last year we're in a new phase in the relationship. We have a much more assertive China, and we are going to have to think through and work through as a country how we manage difference. In doing that, we have to be very clear about our interests and our values, and no, we need to hold to them regardless of the reaction. But that's a proposition that applies in relation to our relationship with all people, with all nations. I would make this point, though. I am a little concerned that we have such a focus on the bilateral relationship with China that it's diverting our attention from a range of other very important foreign policy issues, including the big question, which is how do we navigate the world that has changed so much as a consequence of the pandemic? I mean, the COVID-19 is fracturing the global economy. It is unravelling the rules-based order. It is hardening strategic competition between the US and China, and our region is more contested. This big picture is much more than the relationship with China, and that is what the government needs to focus on. That's what we need a plan for. I don't see anything from Scott Morrison.
You referenced the US-China trade agreement, under which China is buying a lot more agricultural goods from the US, including barley. The government has said, including on this program, that hasn't been a factor in their decision to put tariffs on Australian barley. What do you think? Well, the government hasn't wanted to talk about this much, actually. And I'd just make this point. We've got $40 billion worth of agriculture being sold from the US to China for each year for 2 years under phase 1 of the agreement. When I asked questions about this, the department did concede there was a possibility of trade displacement, which is code for Australian farmers, Australian exporters being affected. What I'd say is this. Scott Morrison is always very keen to tell us when he's spoken to President Trump. Well, I think it's time for him to pick up the phone and speak to him now and ensure that the US-China trade deal does not come at the expense of Australian exporters and Australian jobs. So you're calling on the Prime Minister to phone Donald Trump directly about this? I am being very clear. I do not accept that the government can simply ignore the effect of the US-China trade deal. We know that $40 billion for 2 years each year is a lot of agricultural and seafood product. We need to ensure that our interests are not affected and not undermined by that deal between President Trump and President Xi. Finally, Senator, can we turn to the government's energy technology roadmap released during the week? As a former climate change minister, you have a long memory, of course, of a lot of the ideas that were put forward in this latest paper. Look, I guess the big picture question here, it involves no market mechanism or any sort of price signal when it comes to steering investors towards technologies. Is that the right approach? Can the government pick winners, or do we need some sort of market mechanism?
Well, look, a few points I'd make. The first is we've had a decade of the climate wars. And the cost of that decade, that lost decade, is paid by Australians every time they switch on their lights. Second, we need bipartisanship and consensus in this area, and Mark Butler has opened the door for that. He's been clear. We're willing, as we were in the last term, to try and help the government construct a coherent policy. And every time we get a bit close to it, there's another almighty Barney inside the coalition party room, which has resulted over the decade in leaders being undermined or removed. I have to say, the technology roadmap, for example, one of the things they want to talk about is CCS, carbon capture and storage. And I thought to myself when I looked at that, this is the same party in government that actually abolished the funding for research into CCS when they first came to government, and here, 7 years later, they want to put it back on the table. Well, all we're seeing is continuation of the climate wars, people paying more for electricity as a consequence.
Just on that, I mean, you were the minister who put a lot of money into research of carbon capture and storage. Do you think it is really still worth pursuing?
Well, I have to say it really is for the government to show that it can stack up. From where I sit, I put a lot of resources into both renewables and into CCS, and of course increased the renewable energy target, which drove investment. Where I sit now, and if you look back to where we were, renewables have become much more efficient, much more capable than we might have anticipated in 2009, and CCS really hasn't progressed in the way that many people hoped at the time. But it's for the government to explain how.
All right. Again, your colleague Joel Fitzgibbon has a slightly different view. He says we have to turn to carbon capture and storage. It can make a very, very significant difference. But can I?
Well, Joel and I express ourselves in different ways. I don't think that's new.
But just coming back to the question, do we need a market mechanism when it comes to this problem?
Look, I think Mark's made very clear we're willing to, we've opened the door to work with the government on a coherent framework. And at the moment what they've got is what they call a technology roadmap, which I think is their 19th policy. I think the question really is, Scott Morrison at the press club on, I think it's Tuesday. Is he willing to end the climate wars? Is he willing to actually do something about ensuring we have a coherent, clear energy plan so that we actually get investment back into this sector? I mean, a lot of our electricity infrastructure is ageing. It needs to be replaced. Investors need certainty.
Senator Wong, thanks for joining us.
Good to speak with you.